Tēnā koutou. Nau mai, haere mai ki te puna mātauronga o Aotearoa, Kozoe Roland toko ingoa. He kia whakairi whiako hapori ahau. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to the National Library. It's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. My name's Zoe. I'm part of the public engagement team here. I'd like to start tonight's event with a karakia. Matariki te tipua, matariki te tāwhito, taumai te wairua, mai i ngā ira atua, ki te ira tangata, tihei Māori ora. So this is our first partnership event that we've had with Zealandia. Our organisations are aligned in that we both have shared responsibility for the preservation, protection and access of some of Aotearoa's most significant taonga. Zealandia with responsibility for regenerating some of our flora and fauna, and the National Library, the written word, and upstairs above us, He Tohu, which holds the women's suffrage petition, He Whakaputanga and Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Tonight's event represents a shared desire for ongoing dialogue concerning the sustainability and care of Aotearoa's waterways and upholding the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So before I introduce Dr. Danielle Shanahan, Head of Conservation and the Director of the Centre for People and Nature at Zealandia, short housekeeping message. Bathrooms are to the right of the front door before you hit the glass doors. Unisex and disability toilets are at the back of the space on the right of the stairs. And if there's an earthquake, pretend you're in an airplane, brace position. And if we need to evacuate the building, we go through the glass doors and to the left up to Guthrie Lane. So please welcome Dr. Shanahan, who will facilitate the discussion for the evening.
Thank you. Kia ora everyone, and welcome on this quite chilly evening. We're lucky tonight to have some incredible panellists with us. Personally, I merely paddle in the shallows of Freshwater up at Zealandia, so we do some pretty awesome work up there, but you know, these people here are diving in deep, I guess. So what I'm planning for this evening is to give each of these wonderful people a chance to speak right up front, and I'll introduce them as we go. But I will give you all opportunities to add questions to the conversation as we go. So after our panellists each have a chance to give their first little piece, I will ask whether there's any questions to add at that point, as well as my own as we go. So yeah, keep your brains ticking and do pass those questions down. So first up tonight, we've got Mike Joy, who's a freshwater scientist, but also a self-described outspoken advocate, I think is the best description for Mike. Mike has an incredible suite of awards and is an incredibly knowledgeable person in the area of the science policy interface for freshwater. So I've got a wee question for Mike to start us off. I wonder whether you might paint us a picture of the state of freshwater in New Zealand. What trajectory are we on at the moment?
Well, our freshwaters, there's kind of two worlds in the freshwater world and in New Zealand, and that is in the conservation estate and in the mountains, and where we aren't developing and farming, they're in amazing condition. Lakes and rivers are in pristine condition there. But in the bit that we're in, the bottom half, the lowlands, the lowland waterways, we've destroyed in this region 98% of the water of the wetlands. Nationally, 90% of our wetlands are gone, and the remaining ones are in really poor condition and getting worse. When it comes to our rivers, the key things that are important are getting worse in most of our rivers and have done for the last 30 years, mainly around intensification of farming and in a small percentage of our waterways, which is about less than 1% of them that are in urban areas, incredibly poor water quality there. We see it in our estuaries and our harbours. Of course, whatever we do on the land ends up in the rivers, ends up in the estuaries, ends up in the ocean. And I've just been doing some work, and there's a couple of graphs that I've been sharing with people showing nitrate loadings in our rivers, which is really interesting. And when you compare the rest of the world, then a bunch of our rivers, we picked the Selwyn, the Waikato and the Manawatu, all have higher nitrogen fluxes than the Yangtze or the Mississippi River only the monitored rivers in the Republic of Korea are actually higher than ours for the nitrogen flux going down them. So we are incredibly over pushing the assimilative capacity of our waterways, and we have a bunch of emerging issues around human health related to that, with colorectal cancer being associated with nitrate in waterways, and we have the highest rates of colorectal cancer in the world, and the highest rates within New Zealand are in the intensively farmed parts of New Zealand, where we have high nitrate levels in our drinking water, and we've got a couple of papers coming out in the next few months, hopefully, that will just hammer home some of these things that look like they're just correlations at the moment, and we can't really, be any more accurate. But some really bad news coming out about human health and cancer and drinking water from excess nitrate, which is, by the way, comes from fossil fuels, so synthetically derived nitrogen. So we're making our milk in this country out of fossil fuels and imported palm kernel. So a whole series of stupid moves, unnecessary amounts of nitrate in our drinking water, because the total failure of central and local government to protect it. So yeah, I could go on all night, but I better stop there.
Thanks, Mike. No doubt that's going to open up a lot of questions. Thank you. So we're going to move to Tim for an opening comment next. Now, Tim's a professor of earth sciences in the Antarctic Research Centre. So Tim's research is a bit different. It focuses on the past, present and future climate change, with an emphasis on how the Antarctic ice sheets will respond to climate change and global and the effect, the resulting sea level rises, I understand. So this is a bit different. We often don't think of polar ice in our freshwater conversations. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the impact of ice melt on the future of our freshwater resources. Expand on that area a bit.
Yeah, kia ora everybody. So I'm interested in the frozen freshwater and how its distribution and I guess availability is changing as we melt it, as we heat the planet. So I guess there's a couple of aspects to that. There's an enormous reservoir, as we know, of fresh water sitting over the South Pole, and it's 90% of the world's fresh water. It's capable of raising sea level by 60 metres. It's melting already, and it will continue to melt, and the polar ice sheets are the elephants in the room, particularly the Antarctic ice sheet, in terms of sea level rise we're facing. So it really does matter how fast those polar ice sheets melt in order to know the impacts and the amount of sea level rise we're going to be facing. The other aspect is glaciers that are not in the polar ice sheets, but the glaciers much of the world's population rely on for their freshwater availability. So in the Hindu Kush and the Himalaya, in the Andes, and even in New Zealand, we rely very much on water storage in our ice fields and glaciers. So the path we're on, they'll largely be gone by the end of the century or within 100 years, unless we really do start to control our emissions. So globally, that's a huge issue. So the ice and snow that's in the Himalaya Hindu Kush, 2 billion people, a quarter of the world's population, need that. And so their freshwater access will be directly impacted within the next 100 years and is being impacted right now. In New Zealand, obviously, and we're hearing recently with the announcement from Labour and the Interim Climate Commission, have identified water availability for electricity generation as a real issue. And this idea that we might have to pump it uphill during low load so that we can use it when we need it, because the lakes won't be recharging because the snowfields will all be gone. So these are big issues. As Mike well knows, there are rivers in Canterbury that will dry up, no rainfall, and there are others, well, no snow melt, and there are others that will become bigger because of rainfall. So freshwater availability, we're not going to get snow, we're going to get water. Some places are going to be drier, some places are going to be wetter, So really having an understanding of how climate change is affecting the distribution of both snow and rainfall is pretty critical.
Thanks, Tim. That's really enlightening. Right, so our next fabulous panellist is the very passionate Aaria Dobson-Waitere. I'm very proud to be able to call Aaria a colleague at Zealandia, she's Kaitiaki Ranger. But Aaria has a lot of diverse work happening in the area of Waimaori. She's part of Te Tini or Hākuturi, so a group looking at developing methods to monitor freshwater from a mana whenua perspective across the region, but is also involved in the Te Whanganui Atara Whaitua process as well. So Aaria, could you kick us off, tell us a little bit more about your mahi, but also I'm quite keen to hear about why it's been important for you to get projects like Te Tini or Hākuturi off the ground and running.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou. For us as Māori, we can't talk about our talk about water without first talking about our relationship to it. So aroha mai. Our relationship and our wakapapa. So wakapapa is around connections and our where we fit in amongst the environment. And so we might ask somebody, ko wai koe, or who are you, but more accurately, from which waters do you descend? So the answer to this question is implicit within the question, ko wai o, ko wai koe, ko wai tātou, or I am water, you are water, and we are all water. So this pātai question reflects our relationship with why, and that water shapes who we are, and these interconnections are expressed through our wakapapa or genealogy. So on my father's side, ko kāpuni me waitotara ngā awa, ara he uri tēnei no te maunga titohia, ko Taranaki tēnā, ko ngā ruahine rangi me ngā rauru kītahi ngā iwi. And on my mother's side, I was born below the shelter of Tarikaka Maunga, from which the Korimako awa flows into the Kaitwarawara. And I am of English, Irish and Scottish descent. So another of my iwi is Ngati Pakia. So my focuses have kind of shifted over the years. I started doing marine biology at university. Then as I began to explore more rongoa Māori or Māori healing and using the ngahere as a way of, to nourish our well-being, I shifted to more land-based kaupapa. And then when I started working at Zealandia as the Kaitiaki Ranger in the conservation team, I began to deepen my relationship with manu, or the birds at the sanctuary, as well as other kararehe and animals there. And now, as Danielle mentioned, I've kind of found myself in this freshwater space. So supporting decision-making and management, as well as on the ground in the awa kind of mahi, Kaitiaki mahi. So our Te Tini o Hākuturi Rōpū is a mana whenua group who came together to develop a framework for evaluating and assessing the mauri or the health within freshwater within our takiwa or our district. And this process has been really important for us as a rōpū, as a group. Some of the processes that we're going through are around identifying what our values as Taranaki Whānui, who are local mana whenua, what our values within the freshwater space are, and what indicators we might use to monitor these. But I think one of the most important things that we all recognise is that it's about rebuilding our connections with water and with these spaces, so being out there on the wai next to the awa, because as kaitiaki, the needs of the water are communicated to us through different tohu and indicators within the environment, and our ability to understand these depends on the intimacy of our relationship with it. So that's been part of the mahi that I'm doing there with Zealandia. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Aaria. Thank you. Brilliant. And our final but not least panellist, of course, is Professor Catherine Iorns Magallanes from Victoria University. So Catherine is Professor of Law at the university there. She has incredible breadth of experience on Indigenous rights, environmental law and international law, and also statutory interpretation. So brings quite another dimension to this conversation tonight. So Catherine, you're really looking for legal solutions as far as I understand it. Now, could you tell us a bit more about what you see as those tools? What are those tools for the future, do you think? What do they need to account for and how do they need to change?
Thanks for that. Kia ora tātou. So, I teach a lot of environmental laws, including the RMA, in relation to both water quality, water quantity, and climate change, and particularly adaptation. The first comment to say is in terms of why. One of the questions has been, why are we in the state we're in? You asked Mike, why are we in the state? And one of the key reasons for that is because the laws have allowed it. Right? The laws have allowed everything, all the states that we've got today. But also our laws have been stretched and pulled by those working within society, both the lawyers and then the people that want them moved in a particular direction. But just as an example in relation to water quality, the RMA, Resource Management Act, as envisaged, had environmental bottom lines in there. And it was the operation of that act by lawyers and arguments, people wanting to get rid of the environmental bottom lines, to be able to do more development that wasn't in accordance with it. That changed. And so that was one. We had arguments about the meaning of words in the legislation, and they were persuaded to not go with the bottom lines. Right? We also then didn't have implementation with national standards, right, which also doesn't help a lack of bottom lines. So, our laws haven't been brilliant to begin with, and they've been weakened as we've gone along, in accordance with lawyers making arguments about what should be in them. Some of it has also been weakened by politicians, and you think of, one obvious thing that's been in the news, it's not strictly water today, but think about the tree cutting and people sitting in trees in Auckland. At the moment, it's because a law was made that stopped the protection of those trees in terms of a presumption of protection. And that was a particular political choice. So we've got, and the same's happened through water. With climate change and water allocation in particular, there just aren't the rules. We just have not got the rules to deal with those problems. So where councils and other decision makers are, you could say making the best they can do with a bad lot, but they're not all making the best they can do. Some of them are deliberately not trying to, they're trying to use the fact that they haven't got great rules and get other things done. The laws have made this huge difference in, they've enabled the wholesale destruction, the loss of water quality, the emissions that have enabled the ice melt, and then all the other climate change, and then all this need for adaptation that isn't being met. So that's an existing state of laws. Now, I do have lots of comments about the kinds of laws that we would need to get around that. I just think maybe I've used up enough time in all of that preliminary, but if we were going to have another round, maybe I'll do that in the next one.
Well, I was actually just about to ask you I think we're up to the expanding questions point now, so I think it's actually a great chance for you to expand on that a little bit, because I think we'll be able to get input from the other panellists on it as well. So
one of the key, you could say that we get the laws we deserve, generally, right? In the sense that we have a pervading ethos that is underpinned by values, and people using those values choose laws to implement them. We have a strong property rights system, right? That people have in their head, they think they should be able to do what they like with their property. They have rights to it. We have a system that have since the 80s and 90s, we've had this neoliberal ethos that we should be able to profit as much as we like from the natural world. Right? We don't, but there's a lot of these underlying values that are reflected in these laws and that people are using laws to push. If you want to change the results, you actually have to adopt laws that prioritise different things. If you want environmental bottom lines, you actually have to prioritise protecting, say, other species, even if that means you can't profit as much as you wanted, right? Or even if you might have to transition jobs that depended on those kinds of things to something different. I'm thinking of like nets and Maui dolphins, as one of those really good examples. It's not as simple as stark contrast like that with water quality, because apparently there's a lot of work being done that says you can have both profits and better water quality and a host of other environmental problems that you can avoid as well. But I think one of the most promising ways to change our law has been, and this is, it's both being principled and tactical, is some of the best changes has been that flip from rights to responsibilities, which we've seen push through Māori interests. That's where we've seen the biggest change. Environmentalists a lot have been arguing that for years, but ones arguing for more responsibilities for the natural world have been seen as the real fringe, the real green left. And now suddenly, but it's acceptable politically to uphold Māori arguments, tangata whenua, mana whenua interests in responsibilities for the environment and to implement guardianship structures, right, through treaty settlements. And if we can, and that then suddenly makes it seem as a little bit more normal. We're not just doing it because we're, green radical fringe left, right? We're seen as implementing a different set of values. And so if we can implement more of these guardianship structures and environmental bottom lines as a result, because that's who we are, then we could get much more protective rules on all of these aspects in relation to water, as well as uphold human interests in the bargain.
Thanks, Catherine. I might ask Aaria, put Aaria on the spot now. Just wonder whether, I guess, given your experiences and, for example, the whaitua process, what you see as shifting, whether things are shifting in terms of making sure the Māori voice is not just heard, but a true partner in establishing a new future for ourselves. Where do you see us going? How can we still be improving on that into the future?
Yeah. So I think when you look at who makes these laws and the culture and history of the laws on the land, they have been created from a Western framework. And so when we are looking at changing those and bringing in concepts such as kaitiakitanga, which is our concept around care and responsibility to the health of our taia or our environment, we need to look at how we can shift these and to bring in mana whenua whakaaro. And I think the history of that hasn't been very good. But coming into this process and where we are now, I think there is a lot of eagerness and willingness to make these changes, but I still think we have a long way to go in terms of real meaningful relationships in this co-managed space. And so we have, within the whaitua, we have a system that's set up where we have community voices, we have, the tautoko from councils and things, and we also have mana whenua. But where these are being, are they reflecting a true partnership model? Are we working within te reti house models where, we have the Crown House or the Government House and the tiriti house or tangata whenua, and I think we have been working in these separate houses and we know them separately ourselves, but now that we're coming together in this tiriti house and these frameworks such as the whaitua, which allow for these opportunities to work together, there is still a lot of room within here to learn from each other. And I think a big thing about that is it is relationship building, and relationships take time. And even though we have a real pressure on us in terms of making changes and making them quickly, we need to make sure that the processes that we're going through are being built upon a real strong foundation, and to kind of take time to do those and realise those, what they might look like. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Aaria. Perfect. My next question, I'm going to ask you guys, I just get to, dominate the floor for a little bit for questions-wise. I'm going to ask just after, I'll ask Tim a question, then we'll ask from you guys. But just one for Mike. Some of your comments around the colorectal cancer in particular were quite alarming. These are major health issues for the wider New Zealand public. I was just wondering, a lot of these freshwater issues are difficult, if not impossible, to reverse. But I wonder if you could give us a bit of a picture as to how can we sort of step back from these thresholds that we're stepping over, and how do we move to, I guess, a system of accountability in something like this?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing that frustrates me about nitrate is that up until 1980, we didn't put nitrogen fertiliser on our farms at all. We fixed nitrogen naturally through clover and paddocks. It was just an unfortunate situation for us where a big oil company, I mean, it probably would have happened anyway, but we had a big oil company that would prospect off Taranaki and give us gas, but under a take or pay scheme. So it was only worthwhile for them to have a huge amount of gas taken out and given to us. So, they would, and so the take or pay mean the government had to find things to do with all this gas because they were going to pay for it anyway. So they set up the Kapuni plant then to produce nitrogen fertiliser. But I mean, it was happening globally anyway. For every person on the planet, 80% of the nitrogen in our cells comes from artificial nitrogen now. That's how much we have changed the nitrogen cycle in the world. And so it's a big part of our food system now, and it's having these impacts on our waterways. But, so we can do without it. We can easily do without it. It's like one of these things where it's an additive like sugar to drinks. We used to drink drinks without sugar in them, but, we add stuff and then people like it. And the soil gets addicted to it because once you start adding it, then the natural processes that put nitrogen into the soil to make it available for plants stop working because then you become addicted to it. And thinking about what Catherine said about the laws, what we have at the moment is we have some laws there, but they're not being applied. I mean, given the difficulties she was saying, but for example, with one of the regional councils that I've dealt a lot with in Manawatu, but it's the same for the whole country, the penalty for breaching the conditions of the wastewater treatment plant that the district council has, they've never once complied with their consent conditions around their wastewater, but the penalty for them is, I don't know if you guys have seen them, if you can still get them, those little self-inking stamps that have the sad face on them. So that's what they would get on their report back from the regional council. So I would, I like the analogy of a parking ticket, So if you overstay your imagine if we got tickets, you looked under the wiper and there was a piece of paper with a sad face stamp on it because you overstayed the limit. We would never, people would never bother caring about whether they got a ticket or not. And it's the same thing and plus we don't have enough people. There's no money put into resourcing the enforcement and compliance side of it. So imagine Wellington parking and you only had one parking warden in the whole city. That's what happens. They really understaff that compliance side of things because the councils are politicised, and so that's the other issue. If you're going to have laws, you have to be able to enforce them as well. If we had, all of the crime laws and we had one policeman in Wellington, then it wouldn't work. You've got to have that will and have that enforcement and policing happening as well.
Thanks, Mike. That cheery picture.
Count on me for that.
I know, right?
Don't call me Dr. Joy for nothing.
No, Nice. I don't think you've used that one before, eh? You know, it's easy to forget when we've got this focus on our own backyard and how bad things are in our own backyard, that we are part of a global picture. And I think, Tim, what you said earlier, I think really highlights our importance of being present in those conversations. Do you see anything happening at the global level that we can be part of that might help us with this backyard conversation as well?
Boy, I'm not sure I'm going to shed much joy either. Well, yeah, I mean, you know, in the climate space, in the climate science world, all the graphs are going in the wrong direction. Temperature's going up, carbon dioxide's driving it up, it's going up, sea level's rising, ice sheets are melting, and we're told, and the science absolutely supports this, that we must go to carbon zero before the end of the century globally if we are to keep our planet's temperature within reasonable bounds, right? So this is the Paris Agreement, 2 degrees of global warming. Stay below that that's considered the dangerous level. We've all signed up to it. 196 countries signed up to it, including the United States. New Zealand is taking leadership. So I think on the world stage, we really are showing the way. We show the way on many other issues as well, and we've certainly done that with COVID. But with the Carbon Zero Act, New Zealand's trying to do its bit. But how do we influence countries like the United States, India, some of the developing nations, but some of the developed nations who simply are not doing enough? And you know, this is very incredibly frustrating. I think things that give me a little bit of hope are young people. I think people in general are speaking on issues all around the world at the moment. And before COVID, there was some traction. Governments were listening. The Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, the climate strikes, Greta Thunberg, the World Economic Forum announced that out of its 10 biggest risks, global risks to economies, the top 5 were climate related. And there was breakdown of global governance, which happens because of climate change. We've seen what happened in Syria. And you know, you get mass migration because of climate change. That's going to be an issue. And asset bubbles were in there. But what wasn't in there was pandemics, interestingly enough. And that's thrown the biggest spanner in the works. And some would argue, and I won't go on too long, but some would argue that COVID has really set us back in terms of the climate crisis, just because we're now all circling the wagons and looking at, you know, our own backyards and personal health, which of course is a huge issue. But I would argue there is a strong argument that COVID and the international financial stimulus that's going in, $10 trillion globally into economies, is a real big opportunity to deal with, a one-off, once-in-a-generation opportunity to deal with some of these issues, including all environmental issues, including climate change, as we re-gear our economies to be more sustainable. And, you know, the opportunities are right here, right now, and we won't get them again. So I think the world has a real opportunity to kill a number of birds, sorry about that, Zealandia, with one stone.
Yeah, thanks for that reference.
Yeah, it's a poor one, isn't it?
Nice. Anyone in the audience like to offer up a question? Right at the back. Yes, there.
Hello, thank you for your contributions. My name's Nina. Just talking about colorectal cancer to start off with, I'm a GP, and I did a locum in Southland about 2 years ago. Now, I know they eat a lot of meat there. They have kind of bacon for breakfast and mince for lunch and roast for dinner, but I have never in my life, in my work as a GP, which is sort of 25 years now, seen so much colorectal cancer. So I had thought it was the meat, but in actual fact, it might actually be the water as well. A second point is about food security. So 2 years ago, I went to Peru, and I was sort of somewhat shocked at how desolate the eastern border of Peru is. It's basically a desert with these big glacial-fed rivers producing, food bowls where they grow, avocados the size of footballs and oranges amongst the desert. And we were up in the Andes, and our guide pointed out how much the glaciers had receded in the last 5 years. So for the South American countries, that's going to presumably raise huge issues about food security, because that's basically their sort of food bowl. Would that be correct?
Looks like nods all round. Thanks for your comment. So a question, any other question? We'll take one more before we... I've got a lot of hands to pick from. There'll be another chance. We'll take the lady right up the back there, Steve. Thanks. Yes.
Kia ora, guys. Sorry, I tried to stand up, but I put the lectern down, so now I'm seated. So apologies, everyone. Aaria, I understand that you're involved with a lot of volunteer opportunities locally and also further afield in your people's role here, and I wondered if you or perhaps the wider group could suggest some local volunteer opportunities that maybe perhaps the people in this room could help out with, if you know of any, or if there are things that you know we should be doing but perhaps aren't aware of yet.
Yeah, kia ora. Well, we have a lot of volunteer opportunities at Zealandia. So I used to look after the aviators or the bird feeders there. It's an interesting question because within our Hākuturi mahi that we have, that we are doing, we've had a lot of interest in people wanting to get involved because they're super interested in seeing, what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I think we're not quite at the stage where we're looking for volunteers, but because we're still just forming our rōpū and we are building our still working on our framework and our process for what we're doing, we're kind of not asking people to back off, but, just being like, give us our space so that we can understand where we're going before we start to bring in people to tautoko that. Also, within that rōpū, part of us are working, it's part of our work and our roles, and we're really fortunate for that, but also part of our members are volunteers. And I think as Māori and as mana whenua, quite a lot of the mahi that we do is volunteer mahi in our spare time, and that's just, how you do it, how you tautoko kaupapa. But I guess there are a lot of volunteer opportunities for different things. In the freshwater space, I'm trying to think about a few things. We've got somebody here from Mountains to Sea who have volunteer opportunities with Whitebait Connection, so in the awa staff working, and they really focus on education for kura, for kids, school kids. And they also have a marine program which I volunteer with as well. So there's heaps of stuff, but we can talk after.
Nice. Thanks, Aaria. Right, might just bring us back again. Maybe a question for Catherine. Legal personhood. I mean, we've seen examples in Whanganui and Te Wera. I wonder if you have thoughts, now that we're a couple of years in, and what part these sorts of tools might play in actually helping us forward with this freshwater challenge.
I think these tools have been probably the most exciting development in environmental law, even though they actually came through a treaty settlement process. So there is a settlement of Māori interests under the treaty, and as part of that, one of the interests in all of so far there's 3 legal people been agreed to, 2 of them are in legislation, but there's a lot. So we have the Whanganui River, Te Awa Tupua, and Te Urawera was a national park. There's also Mount Taranaki coming up. It's been agreed to but not legislated for. And there's, I can say at least 5 other iwi who say they would like to have, some of them have settled and they go, damn, we've already settled. We wish we, could have got that before. And others are still looking at that kind of thing. So treaty settlement process, but they're implementing kaitiakitanga and responsibility. And that's what, and so that sets a different set of values, but it's not just the values, it's actually got a guardianship body. It's got a structure whose job it is to look after the interests of the environment, in this case. I'm just going to make it generically, the environment, the legal person. But there's other ones that signal this different set of values and status in law, which gets it away from our traditional property rights. And that's, so no one owns now that piece where they used to own it. They're saying it owns itself. So the Crown doesn't own it, the iwi doesn't own it, but it owns itself. So it's seen as a separate person with its own. Well, it's not, I mean, they say the rights, duties and powers, right, of a legal person. There's a big movement called Rights of Nature who see that, oh my God, it's got rights, nature's got rights. And there's very, very few rights implemented in this. It's really a responsibility framework, which is what's so exciting about it. And so it could be used. I mean, you could use the rights and the responsibilities. If we saw, for example, godwits or trees or, maybe whether or not water itself, but other living things in water, if we saw them as having many more rights to exist and not be interfered with, that couldn't be outweighed so easily by our rights, like to profit or, make a living or whatever it was, then more rights on their side might balance out some of ours. And so that's helpful for showing there's maybe a different set of rights involved, but it's also, helpful for this. We have more of a responsibility. It's not just to look after ourselves, which is really interesting. When you compare, the biggest traction we get on environmental issues are when they affect human health. So these, as Mike's been complaining about the state of waterways for years, and macroinvertebrate index, and why isn't that being used? Why are we just measuring nitrates? Why aren't we looking at whether things are living and dying in that water? And then people don't care about it. But suddenly, oh my God, we're getting cancer. Now we're going to care about it. So, which is a real pity. I mean, I'm the first one to say, why don't we all argue as strategically as a human right to a healthy environment? I gave a TED talk on that once, 2015. That was many years ago. But so as a tool, it's a great tool. But it's not where we need to be if we're going to make a bigger difference. That's what. So, that's why I think that's really exciting. And that's totally apart from better implementing Māori cosmology for Māori rights interests. That's in my sense, as an environmental lawyer, that would be a co-benefit. But of course, from their point of view, then the environmental protection's their co-benefit. So, I recognise that completely. I'm just looking at it from this water perspective. And at some stage later, I can comment on that global one, but I've done my best.
Nice. Well, we're actually starting to run out of time too. I do have one more thought, which is, I guess something that's quite prominent in the discussion at the moment is the idea that we've got these 11,000 jobs for nature. I guess what I'm hearing tonight is it's all very well, but we need massive systemic change in our laws and our regulations. Is that a correct observation? Maybe anyone would like to comment.
I'm always banging on about how you can't clean up rivers, There's all this money. We'll put all these people and they'll clean up rivers. You can't clean up a river while you're still polluting it, And we've just... So Catherine just made the point about human health and how it should make a difference, but it didn't. I mean, Minister Parker did not uphold our recommendations from the Science Technical Advisory Group at that last national paper. We've just gone through this whole process. That this government had the mandate of 80% of New Zealanders saying that freshwater is the biggest issue for them. Multiple polls said that. Many people say they won the election or National lost the election on their failure to protect freshwater. The Science Technical Advisory Group, the Kahui Wai Māori Advisory Group, said we need to put in these stronger, limits. And one of those limits was to have nitrate set at 1 milligram, which would protect not just ecosystem health, but also human health for colorectal cancer, and he failed to do it. He just let it go. And so, even human health, even colorectal cancer is not enough. So
were you given a reason for that, or is it just...
No, well, they said a lack of scientific consensus. Oh. So if you're going to take that line, then we don't do anything about climate change, because because you haven't got 100% of the scientists agreeing on it, then we don't do anything about it. So that was their That was their set excuse. And then we saw what was found to be clause 107 in that policy was that hora whenua and pukekohe are exempt from these water protections because they produce vegetables, and some rubbish advice from MPI said that if they were to put these in, then there'd be a reduction in vegetable production of 40%. And Minister Parker said that would threaten the health of New Zealanders. So they're going to allow the pollution of those waterways in hora whenua and pukekohe because of vegetable health of humans, but not drinking water health of humans. You know, it makes no sense whatsoever. And I guess you can tell I'm angry because for 20 years, I've been fighting with a whole lot of other people to highlight these issues. We gave the government the mandate. They had it for the first time ever, and they didn't take it. So, you know, what more can you do than that, you know?
Yeah. Given how long it took us to move on the climate change debate, you know, I don't know, any thoughts from anyone else on this topic?
Oh, just very briefly on I mean, we've got to have government, we've got to have leadership. We've got to have good governance and good leadership to solve the climate problem because it's so urgent. I mean, we don't have much time. We're going to be at 1.5 degrees in 10 years and 2 degrees in 20 years, so we simply have no time. So it's a ground up, but it's a top down, and we're failing badly on that too.
Cool. Now, I might just give you a chance to think of a question and maybe bounce it off your neighbour. And I'll give you 1 minute to do that. Maybe just talk about one of the highlights from this last little bit, and then I'll ask for questions from the group. So I'll give you a minute to just talk to the person next to you, and then we'll come back for a final round of questions.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
All right. Might just come back together now. Now, after that little moment, does anyone have a question they would like to offer? Owen, up the back.
If someone from the panel would care to comment on the national policy statements and whether they think they might make a difference or not.
No. I mean, I just really have to tell the story over and over again of the government set up these 3 groups that they made public to you and told you all about. Science Technical Advisory Group, Kahui Waimaori Leaders Group, worked with us behind our backs that we discovered afterwards the ministry was having secret meetings with the ag industry, and they were writing the policy and skiting amongst themselves, and it was the skiting amongst federated farmers about how they were writing the policy for freshwater that meant that it got leaked out and we got a copy of it and then went back to the ministry and said, oi, what's going on here? Oh, and they were all embarrassed because we caught them out. And that industry lobby power is incredible. You just never underestimate how powerful that industry lobby is and so they basically got what they want. To use that example of the car parking in Wellington, all you have to have is what the industry wanted and what they got is a farm environment plan. So you park the car, and then as long as you've got a plan to be back within 2 hours, then that's okay. That's all you have to do is have a plan. And then you don't, because you're only going to get a sad face stamp anyway. But but have a plan. So that's the really, really sad reality. And despite the Kahuiwai Māori group and the powerful kōrero that went on about, I'll never forget Dover Samuels, the regional councils are the problem in this country with fresh water. It's that failure of those regional councils. Of course, they need to have good national policy in the first place, but they can't even apply their own recommendations, their own plans. I've been involved, my legal fights have been with Horizons Regional Council to get them to apply their own plan around farm intensity. And we win in the courts, and then they still won't apply it. So, that whole process to come back to national policy statement, no, it's a failure, and no, it won't achieve any improvement.
Thanks. All right, I think you've had your hand up for a little while. Front here.
Thank you all very much.
Here's the microphone.
Thank you all. We all know each other, I think. The focus for tonight has been quite a bit on quality of water, although Catherine's in particular, we're touching on policy and law. But there are huge issues which we're also not even trying to solve around allocation and the inequity of Māori exclusion from access to water for either the health of the river and for commercial purposes or development purposes. And the issue of should there be commercial payment for water and what effects would that have? And also just that tendency to recognise kaitiakitanga, and we fall very far short of having a te tiriti framework of governance which would give Māori the authority to be involved in decision making. So I'm just wondering if you have comments on commercial costs and some of these structural issues, and what are the prospects for a much stronger law so that we have accountability for our use of water?
That's a big question.
I have a very simple answer, is that yes, you need the changes, you need the costs, you need the accountability. What's the prospect for it? Well, that's political. That's your political prospects. You're not going to get a law change. Well, not very likely to get a case that mandates you adopt a particular set of allocation rules. They might say you need to adopt some, but what the precise ones are going to is a policy government position, and that'll be left to the politics.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I could try and touch on it. I think that one place where we could look to getting more change, like that's really disheartening hearing about the NPSFM working with regional councils within that space to try and implement some of those values and things within there. But I think another place where we can see the change is from within iwi, a real focus, and I think a really important thing for them to do is to develop iwi kaitiaki management plans. And when they have that and they've outlined their values and what they look like and the limits that they're not going to move on in terms of the environment and water allocation and things like that, that is another push, and I think an example of similar to the legal personhood, how that came out of tiriti settlements, and it's an opportunity for iwi to take the lead within that space. I might leave it there.
That's great. Good little piece of hope there, perhaps. One final question from the audience, if there is one. Right. Oh gosh. Choices. I think this gentleman in the middle had his hand up for a very long time. Yes, yep.
I've changed my question.
Oh, okay.
Just want you to imagine a situation where the contract under which the ammonia urea plant at Kapuni gets its gas supplied to it was to be abrogated. and you simply cut the ability to produce the fertiliser. What would happen? Like Kiwi Point.
So there's one plant in New Zealand that makes this nitrate fertiliser that Jess just talked about. But only 1/3 of the nitrate that's used in agriculture in New Zealand comes from that plant. So there's 2/3 coming from the Middle East, and I expect they would just top it up from there. But the frustrating thing is that there's multiple examples, and Catherine touched on this, where we've shown, or many case studies have shown, that there is more profit for farmers putting less nitrogen into their system, backing off on those inputs, and you actually make more profit, because unlike the banks seem to imagine that it's like a factory, and the more fertilizer you put on, the more milk you make. But actually, farms are biological systems, and they reach an inflection point where you don't get more from pouring more stuff in there. But there's such incredibly high levels of debt on farm in New Zealand, and a real pressure from banks to keep on cranking these things along at extreme rates. So, it comes back to that, the really fundamental changes that we need to make in the whole thing. And I don't know if many of you have noticed, but there's a real push for the idea of regenerative farming, and that is, just backing off those inputs. And so if we shut down Kapuni, there's a whole lot of gas that could be used for something more useful than that. And then as long as we didn't fill that gap by going and getting it somewhere else, then we could be some real improvements in freshwater and nitrous oxide emissions and all the other problems as well.
Can I just bring it back? There's a question made about the global food problem, and we've heard about the 1.5, and by 1.5 degrees in 10 years, and by 2 degrees in 20 years likely. By 2050, there's lots of predictions of an absolute breakdown in the world food supply. That's within most of this country's lifetime in terms of the people around now, and that should be making decisions on that. So there's this huge effort to get our water, fresh water, under control and cleaned up, right? And our food system. I heard it on the radio today but we don't want to become the Gloria Vale of the South Pacific, which I thought was like, cut ourselves off and just do our own thing. And I thought, well, I don't like the analogy, but in one sense it's apt in the sense of we could just completely isolate and make ours perfect. We could become the paradise of the South Pacific. But if everybody else has lost theirs, they're just going to come and take ours. So we actually have to pay attention to the global problem, and that's where I think maybe this water movie, I haven't actually seen it, but I gather it's very much about the global situation in water, and we may think we don't have to worry about it because we've got so many problems in our own backyard, but like climate change, if we don't, it's going to come around to bite us in the bum.
Absolutely. Brilliant comment. Now, it's time for me to wrap this up, an incredible conversation. But what I will do, I've never met a person working in the environmental sector who's not at their core an optimist. I don't think you can continue in this field if you're not at your core an optimist. So I might just ask each of you just to give us a couple of sentences on where do you find your hope from? Right.
I find my hope... I do have hope, because I can see and I can vision where we need to be, and a life with a lot less consumption and without all those inputs into external fake inputs into food production means much healthier food. The lifestyles that without all that energy and burning all those fossil fuels. And we had a hint of it under lockdown, about life can be a lot better with less. And so we have to figure out this idea of what's enough, and that's the limit for us, is just enough, not always driving for more and more and more. So it's how we get there. If we manage our way to it, we can have it a relatively easy time. If we just keep putting the foot on the gas and then wait for the crash, then it will be ugly. So I can see a much nicer future, and that's what I'm hoping for.
Kia ora. I find my hope within the restoration of our reconnection to the Whenua. And there are many examples of this happening throughout Aotearoa and throughout the world globally. And I think that, also hope from our tupuna and hope for our future generations. So as kaitiaki, we continue to do the mahi around the protection of the taiao that our ancestors have done before us. And the reason why we do that is for the future generation, and to make sure that the whenua and the wai that we're leaving behind is in a better state than it is now. And so, really hopeful for that. So, kia ora.
Kia ora. Tim?
I oscillate on this, but I always feel I have to have a message of hope, and I generally do. It's the odd dinner party conversation where you think of 10 billion people on the planet and the way we've utilised resources, but you can't think like that. Two things. I think ultimately, I think our values are changing. I think they've always been there. And I just look at so many things that are going on in the world today where people are saying enough's enough. So I do have hope in us. And if we don't have hope in us, then there's no hope. But I also have hope in good governance and leadership. I do think things can change. We've had a bad run of it lately. Won't point any fingers. But, we've got great examples in the world. And there's an election in the US coming up. And if people just keep that voice out there, that gives me hope.
Yeah, I'm another oscillator. I can't help it. If you want to talk about natural person, I'm like Tigger, who just bounces around and just doesn't. I just ignore all the bad things. All right, that would be my thing. So I can't help. I go into class and I'm literally teaching the apocalypse and the end of the world, the state of the world, your future of food in 2050. Right. And I'm doing it with a smile because I can make jokes. And I'm dealing with students who are really super concerned about it. So daily, when you surround yourself by people who are super concerned and working to do something about it, you figure there's hope. Then someone in my family leaves News Talk ZB on the radio in the car, and I get in, and I just like, oh my God, switch it. And because then when you hear what, it's like hearing the lobbyists, when you hear the stories and you hear about what people are saying who really want to stay back in the past, it's really depressing. And you think, oh my God, there isn't any. And where those trajectories of power are, it's like they say, follow the money, follow the power. And then that's really depressing, seeing what the fishing industry is paying for in this country, in terms of advice and lobbying. So I do it by ignoring the voices of all the bad stuff, because otherwise it would just be too depressing.
Thank you. That's all we've got time for, but thank you so much, and join me in showing our appreciation.